It is not likely that anyone in Boston or any alert reader elsewhere will ever forget the strange affair of the Cabot Museum. The newspaper publicity given to that hellish mummy, the antique and terrible rumors vaguely linked with it, the morbid wave of interest in cult activities during 1932, and the frightful fate of the two intruders on December 1st of that year, all combined to form one of those classic mysteries which go down for generations as folklore and become the nuclei of whole cycles of horrific speculation. Everyone seems to realize, too, that something very vital and unutterably hideous was suppressed in the public accounts of the culminant horrors. Those first disquieting hints as to the condition of one of the two bodies were dismissed and ignored too abruptly, nor were the singular modifications in the mummy given the following up which their news value would normally prompt. It also struck people as queer that the mummy was never restored to its case. In these days of expert taxidermy, the excuse that its disintegrating condition made exhibition impracticable seemed a peculiarly lame one. As curator of the museum, I am in a position to reveal all the suppressed facts, but this I shall not do during my lifetime. There are things about the world and universe which it is better for the majority not to know, and I have not departed from the opinion in which all of us, museum staff, physicians, reporters, and police, concurred at the period of the horror itself. At the same time, it seems proper that a matter of such overwhelming scientific and historic importance should not remain wholly unrecorded. Hence this account which I have prepared for the benefit of serious students. I shall place it among various papers to be examined after my death, leaving its fate to the discretion of my executors. Certain threats and unusual events during the past weeks have led me to believe that my life, as well as that of other museum officials, is in some peril through the enmity of several widespread secret cults of Asiatics, Polynesians, and heterogeneous mystical devotees. Hence it is possible that the work of the executors may not be long postponed. Executors note: Dr. Johnson died suddenly and rather mysteriously of heart failure on April 22, 1933. Wentworth Moore, taxidermist of the museum, disappeared around the middle of the preceding month. On February 18th of the same year, Dr. William Minot, who superintended a dissection connected with the case, was stabbed in the back, dying the following day. The real beginning of the horror, I suppose, was in 1879, long before my term as curator, when the museum acquired that ghastly, inexplicable mummy from the Orient Shipping Company. Its very discovery was monstrous and menacing, for it came from a crypt of unknown origin and fabulous antiquity on a bit of land suddenly upheaved from the Pacific's floor. On May 11, 1878, Captain Charles Weatherby of the freighter Eridanus, bound from Wellington, New Zealand to Valparaiso, Chile, had sighted a new island unmarked on any chart and evidently of volcanic origin. It projected quite boldly out of the sea in the form of a truncated cone. A landing party under Captain Weatherby noted evidences of long submersion on the rugged slopes which they climbed, while at the summit there were signs of recent destruction, as by an earthquake. Among the scattered rubble were massive stones of manifestly artificial shaping, and a little examination disclosed the presence of some of that prehistoric cyclopean masonry found on certain Pacific islands and forming a perpetual archaeological puzzle. Finally, the sailors entered a massive stone crypt, judged to have been part of a much larger edifice and to have originally lain far underground, in one corner of which the frightful mummy crouched. After a short period of virtual panic, caused partly by certain carvings on the walls, the men were induced to move the mummy to the ship, though it was only with fear and loathing that they touched it. Close to the body, as if once thrust into its clothes, was a cylinder of an unknown metal containing a roll of thin, bluish-white membrane of equally unknown nature, inscribed with peculiar characters in a grayish, indeterminable pigment. In the center of the vast stone floor was a suggestion of a trapdoor, but the party lacked apparatus sufficiently powerful to move it. The Cabot Museum, then newly established, saw the meager reports of the discovery and at once took steps to acquire the mummy and the cylinder. Curator Pickman made a personal trip to Valparaiso and outfitted a schooner to search for the crypt where the thing had been found, though meeting with failure in this matter. At the recorded position of the island, nothing but the sea's unbroken expanse could be discerned, and the seekers realized that the same seismic forces which had suddenly thrust the island up had carried it down again to the watery darkness where it had brooded for untold eons. The secret of that immovable trapdoor would never be solved. The mummy and the cylinder, however, remained, and the former was placed on exhibition early in November 1879 in the museum's Hall of Mummies. The Cabot Museum of Archaeology, which specializes in such remnants of ancient and unknown civilizations as do not fall within the domain of art, is a small and scarcely famous institution, though one of high standing in scientific circles. It stands in the heart of Boston's exclusive Beacon Hill district, in Mount Vernon Street near Joy, housed in a former private mansion with an added wing in the rear, and was a source of pride to its austere neighbors until the recent terrible events brought it an undesirable notoriety. The Hall of Mummies on the western side of the original mansion, which was designed by Bulfinch and erected in 1819, on the second floor, is justly esteemed by historians and anthropologists as harboring the greatest collection of its kind in America. Here may be found typical examples of Egyptian embalming from the earliest Saqqara specimens to the last Coptic attempts of the 8th century, mummies of other cultures including the prehistoric Indian specimens recently found in the Aleutian Islands, agonized Pompeian figures molded in plaster from tragic hollows in the ruin-choking ashes, naturally mummified bodies from mines and other excavations in all parts of the earth, some surprised by their terrible entombment and the grotesque postures caused by their last tearing death throes, everything in short which any collection of the sort could well be expected to contain. In 1879, of course, it was much less ample than it is now, yet even then it was remarkable. But that shocking thing from the primal Cyclopean crypt on an ephemeral sea-spawned island was always its chief attraction and most impenetrable mystery. The mummy was that of a medium-sized man of unknown race, and was cast in a peculiar crouching posture. The face, half shielded by claw-like hands, had its underjaw thrust far forward, while the shriveled features bore an expression of fright so hideous that few spectators could view them unmoved. The eyes were closed, with lids clamped down tightly over eyeballs apparently bulging and prominent. Bits of hair and beard remained, and the color of the whole was a sort of dull, neutral gray. In texture, the thing was half leathery and half stony, forming an insoluble enigma to those experts who sought to ascertain how it was embalmed. In places, bits of its substance were eaten away by time and decay. Rags of some peculiar fabric, with suggestions of unknown designs, still clung to the object. Just what made it so infinitely horrible and repulsive one could hardly say. For one thing, there was a subtle, indefinable sense of limitless antiquity and utter alienage which affected one like a view from the brink of a monstrous abyss of unplumbed blackness. But mostly it was the expression of crazed fear on the puckered prognathous, half-shielded face. Such a symbol of infinite, inhuman cosmic fright could not help communicating the emotion to the beholder amidst a disquieting cloud of mystery and vain conjecture. Among the discriminating few who frequented the Cabot Museum, this relic of an elder, forgotten world soon acquired an unholy fame, though the institution's seclusion and quiet policy prevented it from becoming a popular sensation of the Cardiff giant sort. In the last century, the art of vulgar ballyhoo had not invaded the field of scholarship to the extent it has now succeeded in doing. Naturally, savants of various kinds tried their best to classify the frightful object, though always without success. Theories of a bygone Pacific civilization of which the Easter Island images and the megalithic masonry of Ponape and Nanmatol are conceivable vestiges were freely circulated among students, and learned journals carried varied and often conflicting speculations on a possible former continent whose peaks survive as the myriad islands of Melanesia and Polynesia. The diversity in dates assigned to the hypothetical vanished culture or continent was at once bewildering and amusing, yet some surprisingly relevant allusions were found in certain myths of Tahiti and other islands. Meanwhile, the strange cylinder and its baffling scroll of unknown hieroglyphs, carefully preserved in the museum library, received their due share of attention. No question could exist as to their association with the mummy. Hence all realized that in the unraveling of their mystery, the mystery of the shriveled horror would in all probability be unraveled as well. The cylinder, about 4 inches long by 7/8 of an inch in diameter, was of a queerly iridescent metal utterly defying chemical analysis and seemingly impervious to all reagents. It was tightly fitted with a cap of the same substance and bore engraved figurines of an evidently decorative and possibly symbolic nature. Conventional designs which seemed to follow a peculiarly alien, paradoxical, and doubtfully describable system of geometry. Not less mysterious was the scroll it contained, a neat roll of some thin, bluish-white, unanalyzable membrane, coiled round a slim rod of metal like that of the cylinder, and unwinding to a length of some 2 feet. The large, bold hieroglyphs extending in a narrow line down the center of the scroll, and penned or painted with a gray pigment defying analysis, resembled nothing known to linguists and paleographers, and could not be deciphered despite the transmission of photographic copies to every living expert in the given field. It is true that a few scholars, unusually versed in the literature of occultism and magic, found vague resemblances between some of the hieroglyphs and certain primal symbols described or cited in 2 or 3 very ancient, obscure, and esoteric texts such as the Book of Aeons, reputed to descend from forgotten Hyperborea, the Pnakotic fragments alleged to be pre-human, and the monstrous and forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. None of these resemblances, however, was beyond dispute, and because of the prevailing low estimation of occult studies, no effort was made to circulate copies of the hieroglyphs among mystical specialists. Had such circulation occurred at this early date, the later history of the case might have been very different. Indeed, a glance at the hieroglyphs by any reader of von Junst's horrible nameless cults would have established a linkage of unmistakable significance. At this period, however, the readers of that monstrous blasphemy were exceedingly few, copies having been incredibly scarce in the interval between the suppression of the original Dusseldorf edition, 1839, and of the Bridewell translation, 1845, and the publication of the expurgated reprint by the Golden Goblin Press in 1909. Practically speaking, no occultist or student of the primal past's esoteric lore had his attention called to the strange scroll until the recent outburst of sensational journalism which precipitated the horrible climax. Thus matters glided along for a half-century following the installation of the frightful mummy at the museum. The gruesome object had a local celebrity among cultivated Bostonians, but no more than that, while the very existence of the cylinder and scroll after a decade of futile research was virtually forgotten. So quiet and conservative was the Cabot Museum that no reporter or feature writer ever thought of invading its uneventful precincts for rabble-tickling material. The invasion of Ballyhoo commenced in the spring of 1931 when a purchase of somewhat spectacular nature, that of the strange objects and inexplicably preserved bodies found in crypts beneath the almost vanished and evilly famous ruins of Château Fausse-Flamme in Aveyron, France, brought the museum prominently into the news columns. True to its hustling policy, the Boston Pillar sent a Sunday feature writer to cover the incident and pad it with an exaggerated general account of the institution itself. And this young man, Stuart Reynolds by name, hit upon the nameless mummy as a potential sensation far surpassing the recent acquisitions nominally forming his chief assignment. A smattering of theosophical lore and a fondness for the speculations of such writers as Colonel Churchward and Lewis Spence concerning lost continents and primal forgotten civilizations made Reynolds especially alert toward any Aeonian relic like the unknown mummy. At the museum, the reporter made himself a nuisance through constant and not always intelligent questionings and endless demands for the movement of encased objects to permit photographs from unusual angles. In the basement library room, he pored endlessly over the strange metal cylinder and its membranous scroll, photographing them from every angle and securing pictures of every bit of the weird hieroglyph text. He likewise asked to see all books with any bearing whatever on the subject of primal cultures and sunken continents, sitting for 3 hours taking notes and leaving only in order to hasten to Cambridge for a sight, if permission were granted, of the abhorred and forbidden Necronomicon at the Widener Library. On April 5th, the article appeared in the Sunday Pillar, smothered in photographs of mummy, cylinder, and hieroglyphed scroll, and couched in the peculiarly simpering infantile style which the Pillar affects for the benefit of its vast and mentally immature clientele. Full of inaccuracies, exaggerations, and sensationalism, it was precisely the sort of thing to stir the brainless and fickle interest of the herd. and as a result the once quiet museum began to be swarmed with chattering and vacuously staring throngs, such as its stately corridors had never known before. There were scholarly and intelligent visitors too, despite the puerility of the article. The pictures had spoken for themselves, and many persons of mature attainment sometimes see the pillar by accident. I recall one very strange character who appeared during November, a dark, turbaned, and bushily bearded man with a labored, unnatural voice, curiously expressionless face, clumsy hands covered with absurd white mittens, who gave a squalid West End address and called himself Swami Chandraputra. This fellow was unbelievably erudite in occult lore and seemed profoundly and solemnly moved by the resemblance of the hieroglyphs on the scroll to certain signs and symbols of a forgotten elder world about which he professed vast intuitive knowledge. By June, the fame of the mummy and scroll had leaked far beyond Boston, and the museum had inquiries and requests for photographs from occultists and students of arcana all over the world. This was not altogether pleasing to our staff, since we are a scientific institution without sympathy for fantastic dreamers, yet we answered all questions with civility. One result of these catechisms was a highly learned article in the Occult Review by the famous New Orleans mystic Etienne Laurent de Marigny, in which was asserted the complete identity of some of the odd geometrical designs on the iridescent cylinder, and of several of the hieroglyphs on the membranous scroll, with certain ideographs of horrible significance, transcribed from primal monoliths or from the secret rituals of hidden bands of esoteric students and devotees, reproduced in the hellish and suppressed Black Book or nameless cults of von Junst. De Marigny recalled the frightful death of von Junst in 1840, a year after the publication of his terrible volume at Dusseldorf, and commented on his blood-curdling and partly suspected sources of information. Above all, he emphasized the enormous relevance of the tales with which von Junst linked most of the monstrous ideographs he had reproduced. That these tales, in which a cylinder and scroll were expressly mentioned, held a remarkable suggestion of relationship to the things at the museum no one could deny, yet they were of such breathtaking extravagance, involving such unbelievable sweeps of time and such fantastic anomalies of a forgotten elder world, that one could much more easily admire than believe them. Admire them the public certainly did, for copying in the press was universal. Illustrated articles sprang up everywhere, telling or purporting to tell the legends in the Black Book, expatiating on the horror of the mummy, comparing the cylinder's designs and the scroll's hieroglyphs with the figures reproduced by von Junst, and indulging in the wildest, most sensational, and most irrational theories and speculations. Attendance at the museum was trebled, and the widespread nature of the interest was attested by the plethora of mail on the subject, most of it inane and superfluous, received at the museum. Apparently the mummy and its origin formed, for imaginative people, a close rival to the Depression as chief topic of 1931 and 1932. For my own part, the principal effect of the furore was to make me read von Junst's monstrous volume in the Golden Goblin edition, a perusal which left me dizzy and nauseated, yet thankful that I had not seen the utter infamy of the unexpurgated text. The archaic whispers reflected in the Black Book and linked with designs and symbols so closely akin to what the mysterious scroll and cylinder bore, were indeed of a character to hold one spellbound and not a little awestruck. Leaping an incredible gulf of time behind all the civilizations, races, and lands we know, they clustered round a vanished nation and a vanished continent of the misty, fabulous dawn years. That to which legend is given the name of Mu, and which old tablets in the primal Nakul tongue speak of as flourishing 200,000 years ago, when Europe harbored only hybrid entities, and lost Hyperborea knew the nameless worship of black amorphous Sathogua. There was mention of a kingdom or province called Kana in a very ancient land where the first human people had found monstrous ruins left by those who had dwelt there before. Vague waves of unknown entities which had filtered down from the stars and lived out their eons on a forgotten nascent world. Kana was a sacred place, since from its midst the bleak basalt cliffs of Mount Yadith-Go soared starkly into the sky, topped by a gigantic fortress of cyclopean stone, infinitely older than mankind and built by the alien spawn of the dark planet Yuggoth, which had colonized the Earth before the birth of terrestrial life. The spawn of Dagoth had perished eons before, but had left behind them one monstrous and terrible living thing which could never die. Their hellish god or patron demon Gatanothoa, which lowered and brooded eternally, though unseen in the crypts beneath that fortress on Yadith Go. No human creature had ever climbed Yadith Go or seen that blasphemous fortress except as a distant and geometrically abnormal outline against the sky. Yet most agreed that Gatanothoa was still there, wallowing and burrowing in unsuspected abysses beneath the megalithic walls. There were always those who believed that sacrifices must be made to Gatanothoa, lest it crawl out of its hidden abysses and waddle horribly through the world of men as it had once waddled through the primal world of the Dagoth spawn. People said that if no victims were offered, Gatanothoa would ooze up to the light of day and lumber down the basalt cliffs of Yadith Go, bringing doom to all it might encounter. For no living thing could behold Gatanothoa, or even a perfect graven image of Gatanothoa, however small, without suffering a change more horrible than death itself. Sight of the god or its image, as all the legends of the Dagoth spawn agreed, meant paralysis and petrifaction of a singularly shocking sort, in which the victim was turned to stone and leather on the outside, while the brain within remained perpetually alive, horribly fixed and prisoned through the ages, and maddeningly conscious of the passage of interminable epochs of helpless inaction till chance and time might complete the decay of the petrified shell and leave it exposed to die. Most brains, of course, would go mad long before this eon-deferred release could arrive. No human eyes, it was said, had ever glimpsed Gatanothoa, though the danger was as great now as it had been for the Dagoth spawn. And so there was a cult in Kana which worshipped Gatanothoa, and each year sacrificed to it 12 young warriors and 12 young maidens. These victims were offered up on flaming altars in the marble temple near the mountain's base, for none dared climb Yadith Go's basalt cliffs or draw near to the Cyclopean pre-human stronghold on its crest. Vast was the power of the priests of Gatanothoa, since upon them alone depended the preservation of Kana and of all the land of Mu from the petrifying emergence of Gatanothoa out of its unknown burrows. There were in the land 100 priests of the dark god under Imashmo the high priest, who walked before King Thabon at the Nath feast, and stood proudly whilst the king knelt at the Doric shrine. Each priest had a marble house, a chest of gold, 200 slaves, and 100 concubines, besides immunity from civil law and the power of life and death over all in Kana save the priests of the king. Yet in spite of these defenders, there was ever a fear in the land lest Gatanothoa slither up from the depths and lurch viciously down the mountain to bring horror and petrification to mankind. In the latter years, the priests forbade men even to guess or imagine what its frightful aspect might be. It was in the year of the Red Moon, estimated as BC 173-148 by von Junst, that a human being first dared to breathe defiance against Gatanothoa and its nameless menace. This bold heretic was Tiog, high priest of Shub-Niggurath and guardian of the copper temple of the goat with 1,000 young. Tiog had thought long on the powers of the various gods and had had strange dreams and revelations touching the life of this and earlier worlds. In the end, he felt sure that the gods friendly to man could be arrayed against the hostile gods, and believed that Shub-Niggurath, Nug, and Yeb, as well as Yig the serpent god, were ready to take sides with man against the tyranny and presumption of Gatanothoa. Inspired by the mother goddess, Tiog wrote down a strange formula in the hieratic Nakal of his order, which he believed would keep the possessor immune from the dark god's petrifying power. With this protection, he reflected, it might be possible for a bold man to climb the dreaded basalt cliffs and, first of all human beings, enter the Cyclopean fortress beneath which Gatanothoa reputedly brooded. Face to face with the god and with the power of Shub-Niggurath and her sons on his side, Tiog believed that he might be able to bring it to terms, and at last deliver mankind from its brooding menace. With humanity freed through his efforts, there would be no limits to the honors he might claim. All the honors of the priests of Gatanothoa would perforce be transferred to him, and even kingship or godhood might conceivably be within his reach. So Tiog wrote his protective formula on a scroll of pthagon membrane, according to von Junst, the inner skin of the extinct Yakuth lizard, and enclosed it in a carven cylinder of log metal, the metal brought by the Elder Ones from Dagoth and found in no mine of earth. This charm, carried in his robe, would make him proof against the menace of Ghatanothoa. It would even restore the dark god's petrified victims if that monstrous entity should ever emerge and begin its devastations. Thus he proposed to go up the shunned and man-untrodden mountain, invade the alien-angled citadel of Cyclopean stone, and confront the shocking devil entity in its lair. Of what would follow he could not even guess, but the hope of being mankind's savior lent strength to his will. He had, however, reckoned without the jealousy and self-interest of Ghatanothoa's pampered priests. No sooner did they hear of his plan than, fearful for their prestige and privilege in case the demon god should be dethroned, they set up a frantic clamor against the so-called sacrilege, crying that no man might prevail against Ghatanothoa, and that any effort to seek it out would merely provoke it to a hellish onslaught against mankind which no spell or priestcraft could hope to avert. With those cries they hoped to turn the public mind against Teog, yet such was the people's yearning for freedom from Ghatanothoa, and such their confidence in the skill and zeal of Teog, that all the protestations came to naught. Even the king, usually a puppet of the priests, refused to forbid Teog's daring pilgrimage. It was then that the priests of Ghatanothoa did by stealth what they could not do openly. One night Imashmo, the high priest, stole to Teog in his temple chamber and took from his sleeping form the metal cylinder, silently drawing out the potent scroll and putting in its place another scroll of great similitude, yet varied enough to have no power against any god or demon. When the cylinder was slipped back into the sleeper's cloak, Imashmo was content, for he knew Teog was little likely to study that cylinder's contents again. Thinking himself protected by the true scroll, the heretic would march up the forbidden mountain and into the evil presence, and Ghatanothoa, unchecked by any magic, would take care of the rest. It would no longer be needful for Ghatanothoa's priest to preach against the defiance. Let Teog go his way and meet his doom, and secretly the priests would always cherish the stolen scroll, the true and potent charm, handing it down from one high priest to another for use in any dim future when it might be needful to contravene the devil god's will. So the rest of the night Imashmo slept in great peace, with the true scroll in a new cylinder fashioned for its harborage. It was dawn on the day of the sky flames, nomenclature undefined by von Junst, that Teog, amidst the prayers and chanting of the people, and with King Thaban's blessing on his head, started up the dreaded mountain with a staff of tlath wood in his right hand. Within his robe was the cylinder holding what he thought to be the true charm, for he had indeed failed to find out the imposture. Nor did he see any irony in the prayers which Imashmo and the other priests of Ghatanothoa intoned for his safety and success. All that morning the people stood and watched as Teog's dwindling form struggled up the shunned basalt slope, hitherto alien to men's footsteps, and many stayed watching long after he had vanished, where a perilous ledge led round to the mountain's hidden side. That night a few sensitive dreamers thought they heard a faint tremor convulsing the hated peak, though most ridiculed them for the statement. Next day vast crowds watched the mountain and prayed and wondered how soon Teog would return, and so the next day and the next. For weeks they hoped and waited, and then they wept. Nor did anyone ever see Teog who would have saved mankind from fears again. Thereafter men shuddered at Teog's presumption and tried not to think of the punishment his impiety had met. And the priests of Ghatanothoa smiled to those who might resent the god's will or challenge its right to the sacrifices. In later years the ruse of Imashmo became known to the people, yet the knowledge availed not to change the general feeling that Ghatanothoa were better left alone. None ever dared to defy it again. And so the ages rolled on, and king succeeded king, and high priest succeeded high priest, and nations rose and decayed, and lands rose above the sea and returned into the sea, and with many millennia decay fell upon Cana, till at last on a hideous day of storm and thunder, terrific rumbling and mountain-high waves, all the land of Mu sank into the sea forever. Yet down the later eons thin streams of ancient secrets trickled. In distant lands there met together gray-faced fugitives who had survived the sea fiend's rage, and strange skies drank the smoke of altars reared to vanished gods and demons. though none knew to what bottomless deep the sacred peak and cyclopean fortress of dreaded Ghatanothoa had sunk. There were still those who mumbled its name and offered to it nameless sacrifices lest it bubble up through leagues of ocean and shamble among men spreading horror and petrifaction. Around the scattered priests grew the rudiments of a dark and secret cult, secret because the people of the new lands had other gods and devils, and thought only evil of elder and alien ones. And within that cult many hideous things were done, and many strange objects cherished. It was whispered that a certain line of elusive priests still harbored the true charm against Ghatanothoa which Imashmo stole from the sleeping Tiog, though none remained who could read or understand the cryptic syllables, or who could even guess in what part of the world the lost Kana, the dreaded peak of Yadith Go, and the Titan fortress of the devil god had lain. Though it flourished chiefly in those Pacific regions around which Mu itself had once stretched, there were rumors of the hidden and detested cult of Ghatanothoa in ill-fated Atlantis, and on the abhorred plateau of Leng. Von Junz implied its presence in the fabled subterranean kingdom of Canaan and gave clear evidence that it had penetrated Egypt, Chaldea, Persia, China, the forgotten Semite empires of Africa, and Mexico and Peru in the New World. That it had a strong connection with the witchcraft movement in Europe against which the bulls of popes were vainly directed, he more than strongly hinted. The West, however, was never favorable to its growth, and public indignation aroused by glimpses of hideous rites and nameless sacrifices wholly stamped out many of its branches. In the end it became a hunted, doubly furtive underground affair, yet never could its nucleus be quite exterminated. It always survived somehow, chiefly in the Far East and on the Pacific Islands, where its teachings became merged into the esoteric lore of the Polynesian Arioi. Von Junst gave subtle and disquieting hints of actual contact with the cult, so that as I read I shuddered at what was rumored about his death. He spoke of the growth of certain ideas regarding the appearance of the devil god, a creature which no human being, unless it were the too daring Tiog who had never returned, had ever seen, and contrasted this habit of speculation with the taboo prevailing in ancient Mu against any attempt to imagine what the horror looked like. There was a peculiar fearfulness about the devotees' awed and fascinated whispers on this subject, whispers heavy with morbid curiosity concerning the precise nature of what Tiog might have confronted in that frightful pre-human edifice on the dreaded and now sunken mountains before the end, if it was an end, finally came. And I felt oddly disturbed by the German scholar's oblique and insidious references to this topic. Scarcely less disturbing were von Junst's conjectures on the whereabouts of the stolen scroll of cantrips against Ghatanothoa, and on the ultimate uses to which this scroll might be put. Despite all my assurance that the whole matter was purely mythical, I could not help shivering at the notion of a latter-day emergence of the monstrous god, and at the picture of an humanity turned suddenly to a race of abnormal statues, each encasing a living brain doomed to inert and helpless consciousness for untold eons of futurity. The old Dusseldorf savant had a poisonous way of suggesting more than he stated, and I could understand why his damnable book was suppressed in so many countries as blasphemous, dangerous, and unclean. I writhed with repulsion, yet the thing exerted an unholy fascination, and I could not lay it down till I had finished it. The alleged reproductions of designs and ideographs from Mu were marvelously and startlingly like the markings on the strange cylinder and the characters on the scroll, and the whole account teemed with details having vague, irritating suggestions of resemblance to things connected with the hideous mummy. The cylinder and scroll, the Pacific setting, the persistent notion of old Capta Weatherby that the Cyclopean crypt where the mummy was found had once lain under a vast building. Somehow I was vaguely glad that the volcanic island had sunk before that massive suggestion of a trapdoor could be opened.